back in 2003, there was a lot more opportunity to maybe be less politically correct, to sort of say whatever it is that you wanted to say. These days, of course, right, 20 years later, you have to be very careful. Part of that is, censorship, right? I mean, if you say the wrong thing on YouTube, your channel will get taken down, so he has to be careful. But just in general, the kind of like values have changed, mores have changed. You can't just say anything you want to say. So I think it's fascinating to watch over just the course of 20 years the development of tactics, strategy, what he says or doesn't say. The fact that he makes certain claims here that 20 years later now he's totally backtracking on, which is also fascinating because a lot of these, it's kind of like Catholicism or something. Catholicism
Hey,
has
but
to
you can
adapt.
see even here, he's never going to be the guy who's out there in robes or having
Mhm.
torches. He's never going to be that guy. He's going to be the guy who he is. Donald Trump has perfected what he'd like to perfect. He just doesn't have the stature in terms of name value as Trump. He's using dog whistles and he's trying to put a good corporate face on his own
Mhm.
biases.
Yeah, and he himself, I mean, like I was saying about Catholicism, like Catholicism has to adapt to society, not the other way around, right? It's not that society adapts to Catholicism. Same thing with white supremacist ideology, right? You have to adapt to the new reality, right? If he were born 150 years ago, no way would he say, the Jewish people are part of the white European tribe and they're perfectly acceptable in the ethnostate for Jerry Taylor, right? Among other things, right? So many.
But what the thing that it gives away here, and with all these white people who, and we can talk on the after show about the Israel Palestine thing, is people like this. They don't support Israel because they really believe that they're white people. They are biblically saying we want Israel to succeed because for the rapture to happen, Israel has to wipe out all of the Muslims and the other non-believers. Then, when all the Jews are in Israel, then Jesus will come and kill the Israel. So they want the Jews dead just as much as the Muslims. The only
Is
difference is
is he
they want
is he
Jesus to do it.
religious? He's
What?
religious. I didn't realize that he was religious.
He's a philosophy major. He's got a PhD, I think, in comparative religion or something like that. But
Maybe I think it's economics. He wrote some book on Japan's economy in like
but
1983.
you listen to him and he speaks the evangelical speak. He
Hmm.
wants Jews dead just as much as Hamas does. The only difference is Hamas wants to do it by their own weapons. He wants Jesus to come and do the dirty work.
Well, even if we're wrong and he has no sort of like religious feeling whatsoever, one thing about him in Israel is he wrote, I think like years ago, basically praising Israel for its apartheid policies, for its like, strict policies when it comes to immigration. Like, it's really, they want more and more Jews and not any other ethnic group. So he also has this like weird alliance with Israel based specifically upon, all the stuff that Americans would say is like totally regressive. And it's also kind of odd because he really tries to champion himself as like, purportedly he's like very pro-American values, but I think most Americans will totally reject it at this point. But anyway, let's start with this appearance in Donahue, go through some of his claims. Um, and just also by way of introduction, he's also fluent in Japanese and I believe French. So
Mm.
he's a little bit, in some ways, he is more posh and different from other white supremacists. If you notice when he speaks, right, he has that
I
classical.
think he spent 4 or 5 years studying in Japan, so he has a knowledge of Japan and their culture.
And he was a child there, I believe. Like when he was in his adolescence, he was taken by his family there. So he comes from like a very wealthy background. When he speaks, you hear, he says what. Why? These are the kinds of whites that he wants to cultivate. That's another thing. I think he totally fucking hates white people, right? Especially like in the more kind of extended sense of like what whiteness is. And I'm going to get into that and why I say that. He wants like a very specific kind of whiteness. But anyway, let's start with this. And like the rate of like just basic facts that he gets wrong, it's really quite something to watch.
Our nation, it belongs to whites and nobody else. White separatists claim he's the Paul Revere of today, warning white America that they will lose their identity. Others say he's spreading an agenda of hate. Let's take a look at the last time he was on. I asked him about why he feels threatened by immigration. He said this.
The Mexican officials themselves are proud of the fact that, as they say, street by street, town by town, Mexico is taking back the southwestern part of the United States.
Jared, you think immigrants are taking over this country? Explain yourself.
Well, listen to Charles Trujillo. He's a visiting professor of Chicano studies at the University of New Mexico. He says that the creation of a Hispanic nation in the southwestern part of the United States within the next 80 years is an inevitability, in his words. He says, I'm quoting him, "We will one day be a majority and reclaim our birthright." That means you and I get kicked out.
Well, no, not. First of all, the only thing...
So how would you respond to a claim like that if you were arguing with him like in real
Living
time?
in Texas, it's never not been Spanish. A lot of the architecture here is Spanish. I went to New Mexico once. That might as well be Spain in terms of the way the architecture is. Arizona is the same. Southern California, east of LA, is very much the same. The Spanish people or the Mexicans that were left behind when they were conquered, they either went back to Mexico, and those that stayed became a minority, but they've always viewed it as their land. But, they took it from the Comanches, who took it from the Apaches. So,
Yeah, it's one of those things where, and he's going to try to sort of circumvent this a little bit later in the interview, but the fact is, just like definitionally, over a long enough period of time, all borders obviously are permeable, right? First, like you mentioned, it's, Native Americans warring with each other, keep replacing one another. They might be slightly different ethnically, different linguistically, different culturally, but replacement after replacement after replacement. Something like America, even if it's powerful, even if it totally, taps still the Monroe Doctrine, controls everything that's happening, south of the border, north of the border. The fact is, as Mexico becomes stronger, as Canada becomes stronger, you're going to have permeable borders, especially if, as Americans, right, we constantly do things that mess up other people's lives, right? We create refugees all over the planet, and then we are surprised when they try to, break in to the borders, right? That's just kind of necessarily what happens.
But you know what? Years ago, 12, 14, 15 years ago, Jessica and I went to Big Bend National Park where the Rio Grande is. And literally, you can walk. It's maybe only about 6 inches deep, the water from the Rio Grande. You can walk across the Mexico. There isn't a problem there. About a year and a half ago, I sent you a YouTube channel of a guy named Peter Santinello who does reportage from different communities. He went down to the very I forget the name of the county down there where Big Bend is, and he interviewed the sheriff, and the sheriff is talking about. There's no thousands of people overflowing to get into the U.S. I mean, you can't even build a wall, because what are you going to do? Literally build a wall in the middle of a river? No, people aren't flooding across there. It's not a big crisis. It's just a lot of bullshit that's made up, and it's always been that way. Yet, if you removed all of the illegal immigrants in Texas, it would destroy the economy.
Yeah, that's another thing. We're going to talk, as an economist, it is kind of fascinating how he wrote this book on, I think it was called The Japanese Miracle, but it was the early 80s. And then late 80s hit, the stock market in Japan hits its high, and then it never sees it again for like decades. And, when we look at, I think if you're a normal American and you view a society like Japan, you definitely don't want to think like, oh yeah, that's a society that I want to emulate. No, you don't want to emulate Japan. You don't want to emulate Korea, right? He's going to talk about this later. And yeah, I mean, like just in terms of like, border permeability, like long term, obviously the kind of situation that we're heading to, assuming, that we survive and, we thrive in the future, people are just going to be, moving back and forth everywhere a lot more easily. We know this to be true because it's obviously much more true now than it was 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago. Granted, there were no nation states 20,000 years ago if you want to cross the Bering Land Bridge. But at the same time, you cross and you meet other tribes, you go to war, you probably die along the way. Maybe some of your offspring makes it, some miles further south or whatever. But that's just kind of where we're headed. And, again, I do find it fascinating how there are people like this who they could recognize how we keep creating refugee problems, and then you complain and you say like you're not responsible for it whatsoever, and you're not supposed to absorb anybody. If you don't want to absorb anybody, you better make sure that all these places are equally nice places to live. And also, speaking of Santinello, I could just imagine this guy going to some of those neighborhoods, like he would literally be so scared. He'd literally be physically scared to be in that presence. And it's one of those things where if you like, you don't know what you don't know, like definitionally, right? You don't know what you don't know, and people like this that have very little actual experience, when they start speaking and opining about the real world, you really start noticing how they really don't know what they don't know, and they don't know anything.
Separating us is an imaginary line.
Imaginary? That's what borders are for.
Yes,
borders
that's
are real.
true. But he's also, I think, dealing with the reality of the fact that the majority of the people on this face of the globe are people of color.
Well, all the more reason for whites to have an area where they are a majority, for heaven's sake. Look, Koreans are a minority on the face of the globe. Does that mean they have to be a minority in Korea?
And you believe that the whole issue with terrorism, we're now on high alert, those are related, don't you? You think immigration and terrorist alert?
Oh, well, the fact that, you see, until 1965, we had an immigration policy that was designed.
Well, before we get to the immigration policy, you notice he doesn't quite answer the terrorism thing, but he's sort of like, he makes this kind of like face as if it's true. The fact is, like, when it comes to like 9/11, they came over not on immigrant visas or anything like that, right? They came over specifically on, it was like tourist visas essentially, right? Like 6-month visas. Is he gonna say, we want no non-white immigration, and also we're gonna destroy the tourism industry in America, right? I don't think he would quite support that. So he doesn't quite answer, but he tries to elide the question.
And this is the birth of the whole great replacement theory, but he uses it by offsetting, using Korea as an example, because so many people here in America couldn't even pick Korea out on a map, even though we were there for 3 years in a war a couple of generations ago. But yeah, I mean, you can tell he what he does, and he does quite well. I'll give him credit here, and even with Danielle Romero's interview, is he drops these little dog whistles, these things, talk about, well, should Koreans be a minority? And you know what he's doing. He's getting his points across without sounding too inflammatory. He's not going to use the N-word. He's not going to use racial epithets. He's not going to use stereotypes. But he's going to try to displace it, that now it's our turn as a white people. We're being persecuted and we deserve rights. What person in their right mind thinks that a white person here in the richest country, supposedly in the history of the human species, is being persecuted? Look at the top 100 billionaires. Literally, I think 90 or more of them are white men. You have the occasional, I think Slim, the guy from Mexico, I forget his name. You have a couple of sheiks here or there, but it's the Walton family, it's the Gateses, it's Bezos and all these people. There's no one. Anyway, the whole idea that white people are being persecuted is so laughable. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. So let's get to his claims on immigration.
The fact that, you see, until 1965, we had an immigration policy that was designed to keep the country majority white. It was quite specific in that respect. Since that time, we've let in millions of people from all around the world, which means that if terrorists happen to be Muslim, if they happen to be Arab, Middle Eastern, there are huge communities in which they can disappear.
Yes.
We would never...
Now, if you pause that, even just going 35, 40 years from his claim of 1965 to about where he is here, Republicans would say, but look at how the gross domestic product has expanded. Look at how, I mean, if you look at what America was producing in the mid-O's versus the mid-60s, this was nirvana. So we're having all these people coming in, and yet by their own reckoning, it's a great prosperity that's happened because of that. Now, I would disagree with that in terms of the loss of the middle class and a number of things, inflation and whatnot. But people like him argue both points. They'll try to say, oh, 25 years of Reaganism has produced the greatest economy in the world, but yet they're saying, he's saying in the same vein that when all this immigration started, we were down in the dumps. And the thing is, too, and I've mentioned this before to you personally and on the show, is if you go back to the 40s, 50s, 60s, right after World War II, the immigrants that people were afraid of in New York City especially were not the Hispanics. They were the Slavs and the Eastern Europeans that were fleeing from the Soviets. They were the ones working in knitting mills and sweatshops.
Yeah, and I'm going to get into that, but first, like even just the factual basis of what he's saying in terms of prior to 1965 and the Lyndon Johnson Immigration Act, it was specifically meant to exclude non-whites from immigration. That is also not true based on not the definition of non-white or white, from the early 1900s or the 1800s, but based specifically on his own present-day definitions of who constitutes a white person, who constitutes a non-white. Because if you actually look at what immigration was prior to 1965, it's true that it was excluding people from Africa, it was excluding people from Asia, but it was also specifically and explicitly excluding people from Eastern Europe, people from Southern Europe. And what do you know? These are exactly the groups that more than a century ago would simply not be considered white. 150 years ago, 200 years ago, they would not be considered white in the way that we think of them as white. So
if your name was Jackowitz, you wouldn't have been considered.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So like even just at a purely factual base, and this is the thing, I mean, in terms of like my sense that he does truly hate white people, he knows his audience is going to be definitely majority white. That's going to be his fanboys. And he knows that they're probably too stupid to look up any of this information, right? They're not going to know that a lot of it was geared towards excluding white people from certain parts of Europe that either they were just considered undesirable or like politically, there might have been things going on, but like just like factually, it's just literally not true. It's not specifically to keep white people out. It's a specific kind of, it's or rather non-whites out. It's a specific kind of non-white. And that definition has changed.
1965. Any person, any young Muslim with a beard, was shifty-eyed, didn't speak English, stick out like a sore thumb.
Shifty-eyed?
Well, look at those pictures of Muhammad Atta. He looked like a cool cucumber to you?
Well, I've seen...
And this is the thing, like, so he's saying other people are shifty-eyed. We already caught him in a lie, right? He's an economist. He knows what the 1965 Immigration Act was. He knows what the facts were prior to 1965. He still delivered this lie to an audience that he thinks are just white fucking, bumpkins and hicks that would just sort of swallow everything up. And he has, total, revulsion over them and just wants nothing to do with them. He himself is like literally shifty-eyed, and you'll catch him actually in other like literal lies, not lies in terms of, oh, we have a difference of opinion, but he's literally knowingly lying about something. So it's just kind of funny, right? How, it's that classic anti-Zionist statement. Every accusation is a confession, right? Human shields, no, actually the IDF uses human shields, right? So he's actually confessing to his own strategies here.
Some Irish people in a bar that looked kind of shifty-eyed. I don't think that's exclusive to one particular ethnic identity.
I think
who would you let in, Mr. Taylor? Who can come in?
At this point, there are 280 million Americans. When's the last time you were driving down the road and you said to yourself, gosh, there's just not enough cars on the highway? When's the last time you were standing in line? We got too many people already.
And that's...
We don't need...
And now I'm going to go over some of the articles that he's written or is publishing, maybe by others. He has articles such as how to have lots of children, like lots of good children, right? So, he's not even, he's back on that Elon Musk kick about, we need to maximize numbers of people, right? So even like in the course of like 20 years, like this kind of stuff just changes so much.
Need any more people?
People of color cause that problem?
No, just all sorts of people swarming in from all over the place. But you see, we import nearly 1 million people every year, 90% of whom are non-white.
This was not a white nation.
What do you mean, not a white nation?
It certainly didn't originate as a white part of the world. And now you know exactly what I mean. I don't know why you would want to tap dance around that.
What? The very first naturalization law in the United States, written in 1790, the country was not even 20 years old. It reserved naturalization to free white people. It was quite specific and explicit about that.
A very specific kind of white people. It's not just any free white people, like not a Slav, not, like not a Slav, not an Italian, not, not these other groups, right? So, but again, he keeps expanding his circle of empathy for whiteness, like a Catholic who needs to adapt to the realities of a ever-changing world.
In fact, practically every prominent American up until about the 1950s had racial views almost indistinguishable from mine. Practically without exception.
You are the genteel racist, as some have suggested. Here you are in your shirt and tie. Yale.
You too.
Yale. Yes. Well, I'm trying to work my way up here. It's not easy. I have, But let me just tell you, you're a Yale graduate, 1973. Is that right?
You've done your work.
And I assume you're not invited back to Yale to speak, are you? Or...
I've tried to get invited. They won't have me. I've been to many different other universities. Right. You'd think my alma mater would have me, but not yet.
Where's this fear come from? Jared, what are you afraid of? We are all God's children. You cannot balkanize the world and say, you're this color and you can't come in. You're this color and you can't come in. Incidentally, your argument of keeping out the Arabs, as you refer broadly to people of Middle Eastern origin, is that we wouldn't be able to find them because we have too many Arabs now. In other words, they'd blend in.
Exactly.
That's almost funny if it weren't so ridiculous.
It's so obvious.
In other words, if we had an all-white nation, boy, we could grab those people of color right away, couldn't we? My grandmother hit them over the head with her umbrella.
Isn't that, look, how easy would it be for Muhammad Atta and his 19 pals to blend into Japan?
If we wouldn't have let all those other people in.
Let me finish. In Japan, how easily could they have blended in? Very hard. How well would they have blended in Korea? How about Iceland? So they'd had a very tough time. Now, this business about balkanization.
The thing is, none of these groups or terrorists or whatever would want to go to some of these places to blend in because it's not the fucking geopolitical center of the world, right? It's not the place that's calling the shots. There's the reason why it's not calling the shots is because largely, right, there is not that kind of level of diversity. Although, of course, all of that is improving. I mean, like China obviously is more diverse now compared to 100 years ago. Korea is more diverse now compared to 100 years ago. He fucking speaks Japanese. He spent, his youth in Japan, right? And then wrote a book about it, which, turned out to be in many respects, some of those statements might have been kind of foolish, given what happened later on the 80s in Japan and, up until very recently and what's happening now in some ways. So, it's these kinds of comments that it's true that if you introduce diversity, later on, he calls it friction, there's going to be some issues that crop up. But the lack of diversity is its own set of issues we could talk about later.
But what he's doing is he's using these examples as a way to thwart. It's what they call a little bit of the Gish Gallop. I think I've mentioned that before to you, where you throw out ridiculous things. What's that black Muslim terrorist group from Central Africa called I forget the name of it. But
yeah, there's so many of them.
Yeah. Well, but they have a they're the most
Boko Haram, or is that the most famous one? Yeah.
Yeah. Why would they go to Iceland? They're
Yeah.
going to go to Ecuador.
Yeah.
I mean, they have more military power than those countries. You're looking like, I mean, the shining city on the hill, America, the most wealthy and powerful country in human history. You're going to, you don't play in a sports league to beat the team at the bottom of the barrel. You're going to go for the team in first place. So, and the one that lords it over them. Of course, America can do no wrong in terms of Taylor's opinion. But I mean, it's just silly, and it's just stuff thrown out there to deflect and to waste time. But it's easily seen through, Donahue is probably being too nice himself, but he's poking little holes too.
Yeah, I mean, like Donahue isn't great here, and I mean, like we have advantages, you and I, because we don't subscribe to like stereotypical like liberal views of race. I'm not gonna be one of these people that says, "Oh, race doesn't exist," right? Race isn't genetic. I mean, you hear that shit before, right? So, and that's the thing. Like, we're much better for dealing with this kind of stuff because we're not afraid to like not be politically correct, but he has his own kind of strain of political correctness that's going to become more apparent.
The world balkanizes itself We don't have to make that happen. The folly is in inviting people utterly unlike the native population into a nation and then trying to get them to live in peace. That is complete craziness. It has never worked.
The native population in this country.
We are now the native population.
Well, but we were, you know, imagine if.
And who's we? I mean, like, that's the thing. If I was like, would he say that Black Americans are the native population? I mean, they've been here more or less as long as you are, right? Like, it's like very often what happens is conservatives say, you know what? America actually doesn't have a violence problem, doesn't have all these other issues. It's really like, if you look at like Black communities, it's like, yeah, but we said Americans, right? Black people are Americans.
Well,
Sorry,
look
have
at
to deal with
idiot
it.
Nikki Haley. There was that viral video of her not knowing that slavery caused the Civil War. It was about governmental regulation or something. Shut up, you dumb. I mean, you know, it's so ridiculous the way. And Nikki Haley herself is, I think, what, half Indian or Ceylonese or Sinhalese.
Yeah, her actual name isn't Nikki. It's some long thing, which is why Trump calls her Nimrod Haley, because Nimrod sounds a lot like where her actual name is. But anyway, yeah.
If they adopted you'd never have arrived. If Native Americans had the power that you want to exercise in keeping people out, this would be a monoracial nation. It would be a red nation.
And if diversity was such a wonderful thing, why isn't it Christmas year-round for the Indians?
And first of all,
I mean, tell me, if diversity is a great thing, the Indians should be happy as clams.
Indians.
Like, it's kind of funny how he's like, oh, you got nothing to say. When in fact, like, what he said just now was so fucking stupid that I would also be shocked. Like, how do I even respond? Where do I begin with this fucking stupidity? And he thinks like he made like a great point just now. Like, what the fuck?
I mean, yeah, because American Indians are going to be celebrating racial diversity of the people who came and conquered them.
Yeah.
I mean,
and which is what Donahue says, to give him credit.
First of all, the Indians had enough trouble with the so-called Christians coming over here and in the name of God being massacred. So let's have a little reflection here on the part of the Christian community who claim to come here with the noble purpose of domesticating the savages. We've used all kinds of excuses to get away from people who are different from us, and we have failed to celebrate the fabulous nature of, for example, New York City. You know, were you scared coming in from the airport? You see all those brown people?
If I'd taken a wrong turn, Mr. Donahue, if I'd taken a wrong turn and headed north, I would have gone through parts of New York City that looked like Afghanistan.
And this is what I mean by you don't know what you don't know. Him, you know, being just like totally posh, growing up, you know, going to like the best schools, going to Japan. He doesn't know what he doesn't know. Now,
let me go. And here's the thing. What he doesn't know: the reason parts of New York were wiped out in the '70s, South Bronx, the famous photo of Jimmy Carter coming in, and the mayor's putting up placards with painted on flowers. That was because of people like Robert Moses, who demolished Black neighborhoods to put in railroads and to put in highways and in neighborhoods that were thriving. In the 1920s, Black people, especially in urban areas after the migration north, were doing pretty damn well. They were still segregated, but they were doing well monetarily, financially. And what happened? People like Moses and people like him around in all the big cities flattened. Whenever there was going to be a highway or a mall that they were building, it was in a Black neighborhood, flatten it, then the prices of real estate would go up. So when he talks about it looking like Afghanistan, it was that way for decades, and it was caused by white people. In the case of Robert Moses, not that it matters, he was Jewish, and so you had white people and a Jewish fellow who had literally single power. Robert Moses was more powerful than any New York mayor in the mid 20th century, and he did more to impoverish not only poor minorities, but poor white people too, who are often living in those things. So when he talks about it, he doesn't even. I'll bet you he has never even heard of Robert Moses.
And when he's answering this question, right, because the idea is, would you be scared going through some of these places in New York City? And he's pretty much saying yes. Now, it's again, it's always very funny to me when white people say this kind of thing because it just shows that you have not ever really been around black people or black neighborhoods. You walking down the street in Harlem, you're not going to be the one that's the fucking target. It's just how it is. Person that has to fear being in a black neighborhood or we'll be specific, like a poor black neighborhood, because that's the other thing. If I go, on the wrong side of the tracks in my neighborhood, that's a specific kind of poor black neighborhood. If I go 15, 20 minutes somewhere else, it's now a rich black neighborhood. You have people coming out of their houses and they're fucking mansions, and these are guys in their like mid-20s, and you could just tell, like, they're clearly making a lot of money, right? They're very kind of like, it seems like they look like out of place, but it's not, right? It's really like it's all black houses and their mansions. And if there's a riot anywhere in the city, let's say there's like a police brutality somewhere, which is usually the cause of any kind of race riot. In fact, every race riot that I can think of in American history has been caused by some kind of incident of police brutality. If there's a riot that's going to happen, it's not going to be in this rich black neighborhood because they have other means of dealing with their grievances. The riot is going to happen on the other side of the tracks. Now, he doesn't know that, right? He has not walked through these neighborhoods. He's never lived in these places. He's very proud later on, like, I live in a rich white neighborhood where everybody is, wealthy and they all look good. So he doesn't know what he doesn't know. And he reveals this, like, it doesn't matter if he has a PhD. It doesn't matter that he could speak multiple languages. It doesn't matter that he could write a book about, Japanese economy in 1983. It's all irrelevant, right, in terms of the knowledge that you have or don't have. Now, generally speaking, all ethnicities prey upon their specific ethnicities. When I was growing up, right, I was around Asians, I was around Arabs, I was around Hispanics, I was around Russians. If I went, 10 blocks further north, 15 blocks to Prospect Park, back when in the 90s it was just almost exclusively black neighborhood, I would not have anything to fear from these other groups. The only groups that have ever come close to putting me in deadly situations, guess what? They were Russian mobsters. They were people that spoke my language. They were people that looked like me. There were people that were from my cities in the USSR. There were people that, are supposed to be like, oh, like we're supposed to protect each other. The only deadly situations that I've ever been put in my life had to do with ex-Soviet gangsters, not black people, not anybody else. It's people that look like me. That's always been the case in human history. It's still the case now. That's simply how it works, right? And we're going to talk about like crime stats like around the world a little bit later. But I mean, and you've said this before, like, you grew up, in a neighborhood that was white, but you were surrounded by non-whites, right? And I mean, you saw like when you describe being in dangerous situations in your true life books, right? It was literally a fucking like piece of shit politician, in New York, that's trying to kill you, right? It's not, it's white people, right? It's people that look like you. And it's another kind of funny thing where it's like, people like Taylor, like they start to do this like golden age thinking about, oh, there used to be, like the Christian empire. There's no, like, what Christian empire are you talking about, right? Like, everybody's killing each other. One European country, another European country, they're killing each other. It's always been that way. The Islamic, what was the Islamic empire? There's no such thing right now, right? You have Persians, right, at war with Saudis. You have other groups at war with each other. ISIS forms in literally the entire world, Muslim, non-Muslim. Like, if you look at the Wikipedia, the ISIS wars, you literally have like the belligerents. On one side, you have ISIS with no allies whatsoever. On the other side, literally the entire world, Muslim, non-Muslim, doesn't matter. Middle East, Europe, who cares? Right. So that's really how it plays out in the world. Like, these alliances are far more shifting than he thinks. So I don't know if you want to add anything to those observations.
I'll go ahead. Let it run.
They look like Afghanistan.
That is not about pigmentation.
Look, do white people live in those places?
Maldistribution of wealth.
Higher.
It's about not being able to afford a school system that might give your kid a chance. It's about going against redlining and banks. Residential areas are segregated by institutions, and we're all fighting them, and you should be too.
Why is it that black populations in every multiracial society end up exactly as they do in the United States?
First of all,
they end up looking like Afghanistan wherever you find them, be it in Canada.
And the other thing, like I like being from the USSR because I have like a means of sort of like testing some of these statements. Like the idea that during the breakup of the USSR, it was, non-violent. It's just such bullshit, right? You had neighborhoods and you had cities in Russia that were like 5 times worse than the worst neighborhood in America, right? You had death rates that could have approached as bad as, the Wild West in America a couple hundred years ago. And again, like it's kind of funny how, he's supposed to be this cosmopolitan, right? He's been all over the world. He's supposed to know some of these facts. How does he in 2003 not know what this huge heartland in Europe went through in the preceding 15 years? He has no idea about this, right?
Because he doesn't have to. People like him don't have to know that.
He doesn't have to know that. And also, again, like I said, he really does hate white people. He knows to the extent that some of this is reality, like no one's gonna like his fans are not gonna look any of this up. Like they don't, and I'm positive now that he would probably be like very kind of a pro Russia in the sense of like, Putin has a sort of like conservative mentality that I'm into, right? But he wouldn't understand anything that I just said.
If you know people, if you like, when I was a kid, I mentioned like how there was a Chinese old lady named Grandma Chin who I used to hang out with her grandson and eat over there. I used to know people who were these Slavs who worked in the knitting mills because my landlord owned these sweatshops. I used to have Black friends in school. One of them who in junior high school was almost beaten to death with another Black kid. I never saw him again after that. His name was Danny Price. When you know people who suffer and have these things, you try to wonder and find out why. Why is this? This guy who comes, as you said, from a more upper crust background, he hasn't had to have that. Now, his bigotry in that sense has a maybe different genesis than that of some idiot Klansman down in Arkansas or whatnot. But there's all saying that he should know better. He should know better, but he doesn't have to know better. The inbred mutant in Arkansas. He's not going to know better, and even if you told him better, he's not going to be able to understand that. So that's the difference. He's willfully ignorant. These other people, your typical Klansman types, are less willfully ignorant. They've been raised that way, and they don't know any better. So, in my sense, despite his Madison Avenue polish, he's worse. He's a bigger problem than the 6 guys with a couple of 6-packs and a Ford or Dodge truck who are going around just yelling out at Black people or other people as they drive by because they're young assholes. He should know better and chooses not to, and that's the important thing. He chooses to remain ignorant.
Be it the UK.
Yeah, I'd like to see the kind of house and neighborhood you live in if you couldn't go to Yale, if you hadn't had the opportunity of going to what was probably a very well-funded public school system when you were small.
Fuck it, let's put him in the middle of a tiny like little town in Russia, right? And make him be born in 1992. Let's see what his life outcomes would be like in that way. I remember there was this one Russian soldier from, I forget what town it was. It was like literally like in the middle of nowhere. They used to have an airport that got destroyed, and now they have like nothing there. And I came across him because he was one of the only Russians thus far convicted of war crimes in Ukraine. And the way the way it was described, like it made me sort of like feel bad for him because it's pretty obvious that he's like some little kid who was put in this situation where a bunch of like his superiors are yelling at him to like shoot in this car, and he does it because I guess he's scared. And now he's in prison over that. And it's like, wow, like you look up his background, isn't it fascinating that he comes from the middle of nowhere and this is how his life ends up? Just this total kind of like, cog in this machine, just put through this fucking grinder. And before you know it, this is how he comes out. If that kid was born in Brooklyn, right, he would have never been in the situation where he would have committed a war crime, right? He probably wouldn't have been involved in any kind of gangs, right? So like put this fucking guy in the middle of nowhere in Russia. Let's see if he even survives, much less, comes out of it.
Well, look at what little he's done with what he's had. He came from an upper crust family. He got the best education. He traveled abroad. He had the opportunity to meet, and he recognizes that Japan is an ancient culture and has good qualities or whatnot. Yet he chooses to abnegate all of that simply because of whatever fears he has, and it's always based on some kind of fear. Now it's more out in the open with Musk and this great white replacement nonsense. But back here, I mean, I don't even know how many times I can say it. There's no excuse for it. He chooses to be ignorant, and so that makes him far worse in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
I'm here to say that I think the majority of Americans feel that they are blessed by the diversity of this country. They enjoy the music of many cultures.
Blessed by the
incidentally, what kind of music? Your name is Taylor.
Correct.
That is what? Is that...
it's an English name.
English,
yes,
I see.
That shouldn't be difficult.
I'll
tell you about my neighborhood. All my neighbors are rich, white, and good-looking, and I like it that way. They like it that way, too.
You told our producer that. My neighborhood is all rich. Somebody in the audience said, "What were you doing there?" Well, this will happen. This will happen. My neighborhood is all rich, you said, white and good-looking, and I love it. I was at a cocktail party last night. And believe me, no one was thinking that we need some cannibals, poor black people, or lesbians to make it a better party. That's a cruel, cruel kind of smart-ass comment for a guy from Yale.
Is it true or is it false?
Cannibals, poor black people, and lesbians? You're going to stand by that statement?
You're telling me Americans feel blessed by diversity?
Yes, they do.
Why is it that they escape from it at every opportunity? Why is it that every church service practically in this country is segregated? Why is it that when people are free to invite their own selection of guests to their backyard barbecue or their dinner party, it's almost always homogeneous and not diverse?
Because that's where they fucking live. They live around these people. Come on, what are you talking about? When I get invited to the parties in my neighborhood, I'm the only white person because this is where I live.
Yeah,
like who are you gonna invite? Like, you're gonna invite the people that you are around, but if you start with a segregated society, obviously you're going to continue to self-segregate. Obviously, if your only interaction with black people is that time when every morning you have to go to work and you have to walk through the housing projects and you're scared, and that's literally your only interaction, obviously you're going to have a negative impression. If you're a white person or you're a black person that's never been around anybody else, like, you're going to have ideas. When I think about Hamas militants crossing over into Israel, like, most of those guys have literally never seen a Jew before in their lives, right? That's not a good thing. Obviously, this creates a lot of problems. You can't complain about friction. You have to find a way to adapt to friction, right? He always talks about, Western society, Western civilization. If you read Nietzsche, he's adamant about this. You need to always throw yourself into friction, and you always have to find some sort of synthesis, and you have to find a way out. Self-segregation is not a good thing. Me working on this film, when I'm trying to think of, like, what could a scene look like? If I want to capture footage, what exactly am I going to do to frame it? Guess what I do? I go through some of those old Ozu films from the 30s and the 40s and the 20s, the silence, because I want to see, what does a pure image that is just imagistic poetry in and of itself, what does that look like? What can I take from it, right? When it comes to me being interested in the arts in general, I said this before, but I grew up like thinking, you know what? Art needs to be competitive. It's not just about, personal feelings, and it's not just about everything is level, everything is equal. And I learned that from rap, because rappers, they constantly want to combat each other, and they want to see who's better, who's more talented. They're very adamant about this, because in those neighborhoods, guess what? There's actually high stakes in something like the arts. It's not just like a fucking professor like this who could like jerk off about equality in the arts. This book is equal to that book. Rupi Kaur is the equal of a Wallace Stevens. That's bullshit, right? And I learned all this by observing people that don't look like me. Even like moving to America, obviously, like suddenly nobody's like me and I have to adapt to this reality. This strengthened me, obviously strengthened me. Like I'm a very weird person in many ways, but a lot of this has to do with the fact that, like, look at where I was, like, look at all these different influences. There's no way I could have gotten to where I am if I didn't have that. And again, he does not know what he doesn't know in that regard.
Yeah, and not only that, but he should know better. And, so he also has more access to other people than someone like me who does physical labor for a thing. He can go around. Even back then, could get on MSNBC. I can't. And he has that ability to go and meet people, but he doesn't want to. But I mean, yeah, and a lot of this is so easily debunked. It's like, I mean, I'm looking at we're like only like 20% in here. Maybe we should speed it up a little bit because he's just there's I watched this very one before I even emailed you about him. I don't think he says really much here, and I think
let's just maybe speed up a little bit, and let's just chunk the bullshit like into like bigger chunks. Maybe give it like every 5 or 10 minutes instead of
Because diversity is not a source of strength; it's a source of hostility. People don't want it in their own lives if they can help it.
No, first of all, I think you're overlooking a lot of the wonderful, wonderful cultures that exist without
New York City is one of the least violent cities in America.
The whole neighborhood. But you do make a point. You do make a point, Mr. Taylor, and all of us have to look in the mirror and say, what have I done to contribute to the separation? But you're drawing in awfully broad strokes here. There are all kinds of examples of the benefits of an interracial society.
Name one.
Food, culture, music, all contributions of people and Nobel laureates who have been from Hispanic neighborhoods. All kinds of scientific discoveries by people of Asian, African American, and, as you would say, Central European culture.
How many Hispanic Nobel laureates are there? Name one for me. Come on.
There are, as a matter of fact, there are more Hispanic Nobel laureates.
He's such a like resentful, like little prick, right? Like he grew up, he went to Yale. He's upset that he's not invited, and now he sees everything through the lens of how many Nobel laureates. Like that's literally the last thing I'll think about. I would ask, what have you actually fucking done? Forget about what you've been awarded for. What have you done? What are your books? Are you a good poet? Are you just getting awards for the sake of awards? Are you just able to play that game? He wishes that he could play that game and he can't, and now he's upset.
Well, with all his pedigree, has he read any book of any influence? I mean, even if it was some obscure tome about the glories of the Byzantine Empire or something that might interest him, why hasn't he done that? Going on MSNBC and just throwing little fireballs that are bullshit again. This shows he doesn't have even a good sense of he doesn't even value his own abilities. He's clearly an intelligent
or his
man.
privileges.
I'm not going to say that. He doesn't value his own. So what he's doing is he's taking the easy way out because Jared Taylor is this ephemeral name that in his lifetime is at the 10th rung outside of fame. He's one step above you or me fame-wise, but it's for all the wrong reasons. And yet he's had far more opportunities than you or I have had.
Yeah.
More Hispanic Medal of Honor winners than any other ethnic group. I looked into this just out of curiosity. Right. In the Second World War, there were 12 Hispanic Medal of Honor winners. There were no fewer than 50 with Irish names, my friend. Irish names. That's not even counting German Americans, English Americans. You were completely wrong on that. You're completely wrong on this now.
Josh from Tennessee, I'm glad you waited. Are you there?
Encyclopedia Britannica dedicates far fewer lines to African empires than it does to European ones. So there. Yeah, it's literally that level of reasoning.
But also 1940s, there were a hell of a lot more Irish people than Hispanics to be drafted. Yeah. So, I mean, if you're talking 12 versus, what did he say, 40, 2.5 times or 3.5, 3 1/3 times more, my guess is that's probably about 3 1/3 times more Irish people that were in 1941 America than there were Hispanics. I mean, I don't know the figures, but that's a reasonable assumption.
We're going to get to some of his difficulties with math in a little bit.
Yes, I'm here.
Go ahead.
Mr. Taylor, you need to give it up. You're not near as entertaining as Archie Bunker was.
I don't mean to entertain. I mean to instruct and enlighten.
You know.
that was a great fucking work of art, right? All in the Family was a great work of art.
Yeah.
He totally pales in comparison. It's not just instructional, but it's also great in a very different kind of axis. And he's not able to get that. Yeah, again, like you said, totally wasted his life.
You really believe that you can stop a citizen, an individual child of God? You can stop solely for tell him where he has to live and in what country he has to reside, totally on the basis of the color of his skin. You believe that, don't you?
I believe in freedom of association. We should be able to establish our neighborhoods. We should be able to establish our country in a way that we see fit. And the fact that whites prefer the society is built by whites, with the culture of whites, is perfectly normal, natural, and healthy, and that right should not be denied.
Jason in Michigan writes, take a look at the Shuttle Columbia crew last week. What a picture of America. A great blend of what it takes what it takes to make the world a better place. Should black folks get on that shuttle, be able to ride the shuttle? Tell me your feelings about that.
I'm not talking about individuals. You can have all sorts of individual exceptions. I'm talking about group dynamics.
Exception.
Yes. When you have group dynamics, you invariably have group and ethnic tension. You can have individuals who get along fine, but when you get groups together, there's invariably friction, and that cannot be avoided.
This is Jared.
What I would do in that situation, yeah, it does create friction. Friction is not necessarily bad, just depends on what it looks like. If I was dictator of America, I would force integration, right? I would force people to fucking relocate, and too bad you have to deal with it, right? It doesn't matter how you feel about it, right? Honestly, if more people were willing to do that, we'd have far fewer problems.
He's also playing when he talks about the exceptions that, oh, but my black friend isn't really black.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This Jew is part of, this Jew from the Middle East is part of the same European history that I've sipped from.
Editor of American Renaissance claims not to be a white supremacist, but a white separatist. We'll be back in just a moment. We're back with Jared Taylor, who believes that whites need to oppose immigration. Yes? The young woman wanted to say.
Mr. Taylor, how would you view the ideal American society? Similar to the Third Reich in Germany?
My views of American society have nothing whatsoever to do with European history. My intellectual antecedents are specifically American. Thomas Jefferson, Woodrow Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt. All of those people took for granted that this was a European society. The idea that diversity was some sort of strength was completely alien to their idea. And as I say, until 1965, we had an immigration policy designed to keep the country majority white.
Yes.
No, it has nothing to do with European history at all.
Here's what you said, just one of many things you said, and you'll stand by this, I'm sure. Ugly Mexicans and ugly Haitians come here to live permanently, but we are supposed to be endlessly sensitive to their peculiarities and revel in the diversity of toadying to their ethnic demands. Jared Taylor, American Renaissance, June 1996. Ben Franklin was concerned about the Germans coming into Pennsylvania. He said we'd all be Germanized. Holy cow, the Germans are coming. You're not the first person to throw up these red flags, to be frightened of other people. You follow a long line of folk, and you do mention some rather famous people in our past who...
Abraham Lincoln, likewise. Yes, he did free the slaves, but he wanted to export every black from the United States. He wanted a completely white society. He said that slavery was a terrible injustice, but the idea of a multiracial society was anathema.
Ugly Mexicans and ugly Haitians, you said
I don't remember writing that. That's very unlike the way I write. I'd be surprised.
Come here to live permanently? You do remember, though, going to your own neighborhood party where all the people are good looking, you have no homely people in your neighborhood. You remember that, huh?
That was largely a joke. We're not all... Well, the neighborhood is not exclusively good looking, obviously.
Right. Lisa from Florida. Mr. Taylor's on the line. You wanted to say.
Yes, living in South Florida, our school systems are horrifically overcrowded. They're overcrowded because of illegal people from South America and Haiti. They come here on a daily basis. We have 40 and 50 legal American children in a classroom that cannot be properly educated, and we do not need people who will not learn that language. They speak to each other in their own language. They don't want to fit in, and our children sit and are held back while we try to teach these children.
I don't know whether it's fair to blame the immigrants.
Build more schools, improve teacher salaries. I mean, right now in New York City, so after coronavirus, obviously that had a very negative impact on education. And what Eric Adams did, who, he's a Democrat in name only, he's essentially a Republican cop. He cut something like a couple $100 million from the DOE budget. He transferred it over to the NYPD at a time when Teachers are quitting at a time when students are just like not appearing in class, at a time when everybody's behind. This shouldn't be happening, right? You need to incentivize the kinds of things that you want to see happen in society. Like, I don't understand really what the issue is.
And you want to talk about waste of money again? It goes back to the military budget. America has a higher, spends more money in real money on their military than something like the top 8 or 10 countries. And if you were to cut our military budget by 85%, we'd still be the #1 military spending country in the world. And let's see what we could do with all of that excess money. What are we doing? Well, we're funding the Israelis and their genocide in Gaza. We're looking into UFOs that it really only takes a few expert photographers to be able to debunk. And we're having all these congressional and military guys supposedly starting a new project, Blue Book or whatnot. There's so much absolute waste of money and stuff. But take some of that money. Cut the military budget down by just 80%. We're still 5% better than the next highest country, which I believe is China. Well,
I think China is right now about half of our military spending. So that has actually changed in the last few years. It's kind of more recent, but I mean, like still we have like Europe, we have like all these things are just kind of essentially our own backyards as well, right? There's different ways of doing it other than purely, and I mean a lot of it is just totally wasted. So
we can never do what's needed to be done, but we can always do what we want to do.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about this later when he has his $14 trillion, out of thin air. Like, we're going to talk about that.
For whatever may be the situation in your school system, do you acknowledge that you're gone? Robert Quezada was a Cuban and was chairman of the board of Coca-Cola. We have all kinds of contributions. I could go on and on.
The point is not to blame the immigrants. It's to blame the people who run this country for permitting this to happen. I am always amazed at the generosity of liberals. Well, let me make a point here, Mr. Donahue.
I'm listening.
Liberals are convinced that it is wonderfully enriching to go to school with poor Mexicans or Haitians who can't speak English, or with ghetto blacks who beat you up and shake you down for lunch money. That's wonderfully diverse. That's wonderfully enriching. But they nobly forego that for their children. No. They reserve this wonderful diversity for the children of white people who live in trailer parks.
Yes, a white kid can't beat you up and take your lunch money. Why would you lay all this illicit behavior on one color of people? There is enough sin to go around, and we are all capable of committing it. Why focus in like this in such an angry, hostile, frightened way?
Because it's real, Mr. Donahue. It is real.
Gentleman wanted to ask, yes.
Yes, I have a question for you, Mr. Taylor.
Certainly.
I'd like to know if your group focuses on anything positive as far as diversity and immigration. Is there anything positive about that your group is involved in or that you see?
If you look all around the world today, the headlines where people are killing each other most diligently are places where you find diversity. Where people in Ireland, there is religious diversity, they're killing each other. In the Middle East, there's ethnic diversity, they're killing each other. In the Sudan, North and South, there's racial diversity. They are killing each other. Diversity is dangerous, attention-ridden thing wherever you find it. I see no good in it anywhere.
And you want to then apparently create nations that are monoracial. Is that how you would balkanize the whole world?
The world started out more or less balkanized. It's only because of immigration that it ceased to be balkanized.
And we got this lousy thing called the airplane, aviation and travel.
I don't understand how he thinks that is at all a claim worth defending. I mean, are you talking about there's like something preferable about 100,000 years ago, like in aggregate? Like, what are we talking about here? In terms of like what, because of immigration, are you going to like, they're literally moving around, right, for the sake of survival.
Well, his own claim about diversity, just to use some obvious examples, if you look at Yugoslavia, when it broke up in the Balkans was, genetically speaking, you could be the Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian. There's there's virtually no difference. There's the difference between go to fucking sub-Saharan Africa and ask them if they can tell the difference between an Irishman, an Englishman, and an Australian. We all look alike. We all sound alike to them. So when what he's actually talking about, he's even wrong on this, because if you look at the peoples that have suffered the most, it's usually when you have groups that are very close together. the Middle Passage was just a historical outlier in some sense, because if you look at most civil wars, it's the same people killing each other. If you you can talk about, I mean, like you've said many times before, you're Belarusian. What's the difference between a Belarusian and a Ukrainian and a Russian? They all started out from the Kievan Rus.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of this is even like in terms of like thinking of myself as Russian versus Belarusian. I normally just say Russian simply because, like ethnically speaking, like this a couple centuries
Well,
ago.
doesn't Belarus mean white Russian?
No, well, yeah, but it doesn't really like whenever I try to like look up exactly why it's called like Belarusia. There's no like very obviously good explanation. So
what's the difference between a Bohemian and a Prussian German? No one's going to give a fuck. We're not in the Holy Roman Empire anymore. Things change.
And a lot of these things become like proxies for something else. Like to the extent that I do call myself Russian, part of it might be ethnic, but overwhelmingly it's much more so like I speak Russian. Anybody, if like a black guy comes up to me and starts speaking Russian, I'll think like, oh yeah, he's Russian. Like he probably did not learn, to be fluent in America, right? When I recently visited a Soviet family a couple weeks ago, in Brooklyn, and I was like, oh, let me stop by this Uzbek restaurant, and I'll pick up some food and we'll sit down and eat together. And I go into this Uzbek place. They clearly look very Asian. They have some Korean dishes, which lets me know that this is part of the Uzbek population that is also like ethnically Korean at some point. They're all speaking Russian, but not only are they speaking Russian, they're speaking Russian and they have the same like intonations and the same mannerisms that like literal like in a Russian movie, or the people that I grew up with that looked more like me, and I just consider them Russian, right? When you look at something like Bosnia, or like Serbs versus Albanians, they have to fragment based more on things like language or religion, because ethnically they're the same. The point is, there's always a reason why some sort of diversity emerges, and a lot of it is engineered for the sake of the construction of a nation state, right? There's like, and reasons get sort of born on top of reasons. So like first one group is white, and then eventually that gets expanded. Now these other groups can be white. Now when people look back, people like Taylor, maybe centuries ago, they would say, oh yes, the golden age of when we had our Christian empire. And of course, like the reality was very different, right? Like religion starts specifically as a way of getting people on the side of something, right? In a way where, like if national borders and ethnicity is not strong enough, religion could be strong enough. Language could be strong enough, obviously, right? The USSR clearly suppressed other languages, right? Because that creates a different set of identity. So, we can choose specifically the kinds of diversity that we engineer and the kinds of diversity that we want to keep out, right? The idea of keeping out diversity in total, it makes no sense. That's literally not how human beings function.
And where I'm sitting right now, 200 years ago, was considered the Comancheria. The Comanches, Mexico wasn't around 200 years ago. The Comanches ran this, and they took over this land from the Apaches and the Utes, who they massacred. It was an extermination war. And the thing is, now, 200 years later, most Comanches and Apaches probably couldn't tell each other apart just from looking at each other.
And they're allied. Here's the other fascinating thing. There was no like camaraderie between Native American groups for the most part, let's say going back a few centuries. But now there is a very common consciousness among Native Americans. And we tend to think of them as like one fucking group, simply because they understand that they all have been put in more or less identical situations by the same group of people that came in and took their land. So there's much more of this kind of racial or cultural or linguistic consciousness, whatever you want to call it. It emerges specifically due to circumstances. And, these things are so obvious. Like, it's just honestly, like, don't you feel like a little bit dirty that you have to sit down and even discuss this and explain this to people?
Maybe could we maybe skip over some of the audience questions, because I don't find them particularly compelling. Maybe just go to the last 5-10 minutes of Donahue. I think what Danielle's show, he reveals himself far more here, even though he's got 20 years more of experience.
Yeah, let's and by the way, that thing with the ugly Haitians and he was denying it. When I'm saying that he's a liar, he knows that he wrote that. Later on, Donahue like pulls out the sheet of paper that shows like, yes, this was his article. So he's literally just like sitting around and lying, like this is such he's talking about, shifty-eyed Arabs. What the fuck? He's the shiftiest eye in this whole fucking like, scene out here, right? It's just so crazy.
Doesn't mean, look, there are certain countries, Japan, for example. Many Filipinos, many South Asians would love to live in Japan because it's a wealthy, successful country. The Japanese have this quaint idea that they'd like Japan to stay Japanese. They don't let them in. And I say God bless them. They have every right to do that. They're preserving a society that suits them.
We'll see what happens 50 years from now.
How are you with the Jews? Are you okay?
The Jews?
Yeah.
I mean, the Jews are fine by me.
And so Jews can live in your neighborhood, then go to your cocktail party with all those good-looking people?
Look white to me.
Did you?
How are you with the Jews?
Did you not take you take money from Pioneer from the Pioneer?
And that's kind of funny because I mean, if you think about like what is Jewish history like, even in Europe? Well, first of all, let's just assume the Jews are in fact like a native in what we would call now Israel. Okay, so they come from this area. First of all, they take a bunch of religions and, it's like all religions are essentially syncretic, right? In that sense, they take like African religions, they take other belief systems, and now there's Judaism. Okay. Eventually, when they migrate out in these various diasporas, or they're pushed out or they're genocided one after the other. Now, in medieval Europe, or as recently as a couple of centuries ago, right, they're living in the little towns, right, whether it's like Russian Empire's Pale of Settlement, other shtetls and whatnot. They're speaking Yiddish, like most of these communities speak Yiddish, which is not, like what we'd consider a typical like European language, at least in the sense that no outsider spoke it. It's not as if people were moving into these Jewish ghettos and learning Yiddish and becoming part of the group, right? That didn't really happen. There's all these like laws against them. They're not like this. This is such like hindsight bullshit, right? Where you try to put Jews into this kind of like unbroken European history, and they're all part of us. The only reason why he's saying that is because at this point, in 2003 and now, Jews clearly, form a large part not only of like ancient European identity through, the fact that obviously, Christians, they accept the Torah and whatnot. But also like, we've had Jewish contributions, we've had lots of Jewish art, Jewish science, like all of that, right? Jewish music, right? The great and almost unknown French composer Alcan, right? He's a Jewish composer, one of the best pianists that most people don't know about. We consider that part of European history. No way 5 centuries ago would people have this thought, right? He's trying to like establish this kind of alliance maybe with some Jewish groups by not also, he's also not critical of Israel. So, that's another kind of like, social climbing thing about him. He knows where his bread is buttered. He knows he could say whatever he wants to say. But if he starts targeting Jews, especially if he starts targeting Jews and Israel, right? He could target Jews, but if he starts targeting Israel on top of that, that's it, right? His channel is done.
There goes the thing. Who has more power in this country, ugly Haitians or AIPAC?
Yeah, yeah.
Fund, do you not? That's one of the.
We have received.
The Pioneer Fund is famous for denying the Holocaust. You don't do that, do you?
No. The Pioneer Fund.
You believe the Holocaust existed?
Look, as I said, my race.
The Pioneer Fund in 1937, they first came to prominence when they were screening a Nazi propaganda film from 1937. So, I mean, like, let's just skip ahead of this.
Say I couldn't name one.
These are not Americans. They're from Latin America. They're Latin America. They're not American. They're not United States citizens.
Oh, so he's talking about Nobel laureates and whatnot. This is also a fascinating exchange because later on, when like 20 years later, when we're going to go over that video, he actually, I think he starts saying that South America is also America. He's like, yeah, it's America, it's America, it's America. Like he's so fucking shifty-eyed.
And so therefore that puts, why wouldn't you want them at your cocktail party where all these wonderful, good-looking people are, regardless of whether they're or not they're Americans? I wish they were. I wonder if their people, if their families would have been allowed in your, if you were.
And like also cocktail parties, these people are such like little girls. Like, what the fuck? What do you go to cocktail parties? Oh my God. They're like literally like you said, he had everything handed to him in a silver platter. He could right now, he could have been the world's most famous white fluent speaker of Japanese and could do like cross-cultural analyses, and instead he's going to fucking cocktail parties.
Who was the guy who translated the famous translator from late 1800s, the 1900s?
The English guy, yeah, I know who you mean, but I forget his name. Yeah. I know who you're talking about though. Yeah, he could have been somebody like that, right? Like he does this shit instead.
Believe it or not, that the huge majority of them are also white, my friend. Probably pure Castilian Spanish.
The gentleman had a question, sir.
Mr. Taylor, good evening. As an American, I respect your right to have your beliefs.
Let's go a little further.
Within the next few years, about South Africans and white Zimbabweans who are being killed and run off their land because they are a small and dwindling white minority in Africa. And the question will come up, should we let them in? Yes, I think we should. I think
he says something about South Africa a little earlier that
they built the country that the Ellis Islanders came to. There was no country when my ancestors showed up here. First of all, also, every country starts off as a nation of immigrants. Eventually, it decides that they like it the way it is, and they decide to become a nation of natives. The same is true with every Europe.
You know what that's called? That's called being a fucking parasite. Like, how could he say that with a straight face? We extract everything that we could possibly get, right, from immigration, or in the case of Israel, from international law. And then when we get what we want, we shut the door behind us. Like, what the fuck? Especially like if you're actually a conservative, not just like a radical right winger, that is so antithetical to conservative psychology. This like total abnegation of responsibility, past all of that. Like it's just, and it's so effeminate, right? I'm sure he would consider himself like a traditional masculine male, but it's so effeminate, it's so girly. The fact that he just lies, he doesn't want to embrace these lies. He wants to like pretend like he didn't say this or that. Like it's very twisted, very, very shifty-eyed.
European country, every Asian country. Every nation has the right to close its doors just as you have the right to close and lock the door to your house. Letting anybody in is like leaving the door unlocked. Anybody can come to lunch uninvited at your house. That is what we are doing to the United States of America. Furthermore, you just heard me say, I don't think the United States needs any more people.
Right.
We don't need any more consumption of resources. We don't need any more strip malls.
Who would you let in, Mr. Taylor? The audience would like to know.
I'll tell you who I would let in. There's going to be a big debate within the next few years about South Africans and white Zimbabweans who are being killed and run off their land because they are small and dwindling white minority in Africa.
Yeah, that never happened. And also in terms of like South Africans being killed, farmers, I think the statistic was whites are half as likely to be killed. White farmers are half as likely to be killed as black farmers. So, this is just so silly.
And the reason is they still, even now, 30 years after Mandela was freed, the whites still in South Africa hold the bulk of the fiscal power.
Yeah, it's South Africa, 60 million people. Roughly something like 15 or 20 million are white. And guess how many?
I don't even think it's that much. I think it's probably under 10.
Well, it's yeah. Well, but like the point is like it's some number that's like somewhere close to 10 million, and only in terms of the poverty rate, literally only 50,000 South Africans who are under the poverty rate are white. Everybody else, right, is black, right? So you could see obviously who has the power.
And the question will come up, should we let them in? Yes, I think we should. I think they are a terribly persecuted minority. The cry will go up, oh no, those wicked racists. Can't let them in. Let them stay there and be shot and dispossessed.
You wouldn't have let Colin Powell's ancestors in, would you?
I think
he's not making the best examples, by the way. He's not giving the best examples.
Society is invariably one of friction and complexity.
So we should build a fence, and we should all stare at each other and be suspicious. No, really, this is a very, I mean this as no personal insult. I don't want to get down there, but it's, this is for a man of your education.
That's why I believe these things.
You can't possibly make this. There aren't enough troops to make this happen. Look, you don't have enough uniforms and a large enough constabulary to make this happen.
That is pure silliness. We've got enough troops to go thousands of miles halfway around the world and change a regime way on the other side of the world. We don't have enough troops to guard the Mexican border. That's nonsense. We can do it.
He doesn't want to cut, that kind of spending, right? Military spending. He wants to just like shift it over to the border or like whatever the fuck else. Or like, I mean, obviously, if you have like a white ethnostate, you're going to have some white troops, right, to keep everybody else at bay.
But in a heartbeat if we felt like it.
Sam, just shoot them if they get through, huh?
You wouldn't have to shoot many, would you?
Sam from North Carolina.
They would soon learn.
Hi, Sam. Community that follows you. We really are curious about this. We'll always live with frightened people like you. I'm just wondering how much force they have right now.
Frightened people. Look, do the Tibetans have any justification in being frightened that all these Han Chinese moving into Tibet are going to destroy their culture and heritage? Are they justified in being frightened?
There are obviously
Answer me.
conflicts where you don't want the people who hate you coming into your neighborhood. Most
Right.
of the people who come to this country come here because they admire the society.
And
it's not about hate at all. And we have benefited so much from the arrival of these immigrants, including my own.
I bet the Han
family.
Chinese who are pouring into Tibet say, we just love Tibet. We love those monasteries. We just want the Tibetans to speak Chinese, not Tibetan anymore. Of course they're justified. As whites become a dwindling minority, the society will change in ways that they don't care for. They all feel that way, and that's why they flee the suburbs when their neighborhoods change. They just have been browbeaten into pretending that that's not the case.
And I love the way that they always use, like, some of these Asian examples, partly because they know that they're never going to have to deal with any of these other societies. But, he also recognizes that whatever that he does in terms of segregation, like he's going to be the one, right, to call some of these shots. So, it's one of those things where like the entrenched interests become dominant, and they're the ones that are justified simply by virtue of the fact that they are entrenched, right? It's just like totally, stupid, like infinite regress that, you're never going to be able to like parse out, which is why I'm pretty sure that, he is probably, an economics PhD and not a philosophy PhD, because I think he himself will probably feel a little, too much self-disrespect to like stoop that low to make some of those arguments. But anyway.
Go ahead,
Every group in America stands for its own. It's about time that we did too.
Own. It stands for its own.
Mr.
God loves you better than those other people?
No. God loves everybody equally. God wants, I think, every group to have its own society and culture as it sees fit. Whites people are only asking to be left alone, to let their own society evolve as they see fit.
And like it's not a dog whistle, right? You have to. I want to be left alone. What he means is we are the majority. We own by far all the resources. We dictate all the laws, right? We get more or less all the presidents, and since that's the way it is, that's the way it has to be, right? Like it's just on its face, not an argument.
I want to be left alone is a famous line uttered by the 1930s movie star Greta Garbo. When you're a movie star, you can easily be alone because you have the resources to buy a ranch in Montana and be alone. They should just call this Garboism, racial Garboism. If you have a country that can do that, he's talking about the Danes and what are the other countries that he was mentioning that being keeping thing out. Well,
like Switzerland, yeah.
Yeah, if you have a small mono racial, a mono people, that's easy to do. But you can't do it in this country that's then he says 280 million, now is up to probably about 340 million. But I mean the whole thing is again just silly, and
Yeah,
go ahead.
Let's just go to the end and just see what
To your question, I have been talking about these things publicly for 10 years. Over those 10 years, the number of people who openly agree with me
Jeffrey Dahmer looking guy
exponentially.
And we'll be back in just a moment. From Preston in California writes an email. I'm a tall, white, educated, good-looking, blue-eyed male from a good family who agrees with much of what you propound.
He's not alone.
I'm also unabashedly gay as well.
He's not alone in that either.
Would you let me come to one of your neighborhood parties?
There are many subscribers to American Renaissance who
but you're a homophobe.
Oh, and by the way, so when it comes to that immigration law that he was talking about, so prior to 1965 and also after 1965, homosexuals and other, people like whatever, different kinds of persuasions, they were also explicitly left out. So again, it was not, white specific. And later on, it's just like education specific. Obviously, the reason why we have such a highly educated Nigerian community in America is because the only way Nigerian can come here is because they have a PhD. It's like self-selecting that way.
Oh, you don't want those lesbian and gays. You said so. What do you mean no? You just said so.
As far as the crisis that whites face today, it's a racial crisis. If anyone is with us in terms of white racial consciousness, that is the fundamental question. I have no animus against homosexuals.
Why did you?
Like he doesn't want lesbians at the cocktail party. I honestly, this is just so weird. This is a
Put
weirdo.
in lesbian then, and that smart comment you made earlier.
Because it was.
Tell me about Philip Rustin.
All right, maybe let's just end it here.